Welcome to the Junior Jobs Podcast, where we interview recently hired junior developers and industry experts to unpack the job search strategies that are actually working in today's job market. Today I'm chatting with Alex Lau about the job search in relation to his new book called Keep Calm and Code On, where we unpack specifically the common ways entry-level developers fail in their job interviews and what they should be doing instead. So Alex, thank you for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Really excited about this book that you're working on, where you talk about kind of the mistakes and lessons learned about, being a better software developer. So here on the Junior Jobs Podcast, the aspect that we are most interested in is specifically the job search for entry-level developers. So I want to start the conversation there with specifically what common interview fails do you see kind of entry-level developers make when they are entering the job market for the first time?
Sure. I think the things that I'm most comfortable speaking about are things that I've experienced myself. And the first one that kind of comes to mind is just lacking preparation for the interview process itself. And so, what I mean by that is there's a handful of different phases that are for interviews that are very common. Like you'll have a behavioral interview of some sort, right? Or a code writing portion of some sort. And for a long time, particularly earlier on in my career, I just thought that it wasn't worth being strategic about when I was going into an interview and approaching that. I thought I could just go in and wing it, especially for the code section. And the more that I've done interviews, the more that I've realized what a terrible idea that is for me personally. Like some people I feel like are just naturally gifted and can write code off the top of their head. But I think for most people, it's like many things, a skill that kind of needs to be practiced and honed over time. And so just the act, like if somebody is just breaking into software, one thing that I try to recommend to them is get comfortable with the act of writing code in front of other people and explaining your thought process as you're doing that. And it doesn't even really matter if the person that you're practicing with is a software developer or not. Like I think just the act of doing it and being in front of somebody is something that I personally have found to kind of make a huge difference in when it comes time for the interview itself. Like just having that practice makes a day and night kind of difference for me.
It's interesting how sometimes little of an overlap there is between the actual day-to-day job and the skills that are needed to be successful
Yes, absolutely.
in that technical interview. Like if you're a front-end developer just moving pixels around, data structures and algorithms, big O notation or whatever,
Sure.
and your day-to-day doesn't make that much of a difference, but is for some reason the big differentiator in the interview.
Right. Yeah. In many ways, it's like a tangential skill that you need for interviewing where it's not exactly what you're doing day to day, like you're saying, but it is like related in that you're still writing code and talking about software. But it's like, again, different things that you need to kind of focus on in order to be prepared for the job interview itself.
So when you talk about explaining yourself or practicing explaining yourself while you code in person, can you give an example of the type of things that you should be like saying out loud, or is there a thought process or a sequence of
Mm,
how you approach the problem that you need to
yeah.
make sure that you communicate as you're explaining your thought process?
Yeah. And I think when I've been in interviews and I've just tried to like internalize everything given a prompt. Like I think it's good to take a second and to pause and make sure you understand everything and ask questions to make sure you understand the prompt itself. Like I don't think that there's anything wrong with that preparation as you're getting ready to approach a problem. But then once you start like actually writing code or like working through some kind of whiteboarding problem, I think it's really important to kind of like verbalize what you're thinking. And the way that I kind of think about this is if I'm given like a bigger, more architectural task in my day job, I want this to kind of be the same sort of thought process that I'm going to use in my day job. And what I mean by that is to have like a plain English definition of the steps that I'm walking through. So like say that like a feature that I'm given for my day job is to connect with a third party API and like import some of the data, right? I would consider it less than optimal way to just like do everything in one giant PR and submit it all at once and have like all of that code kind of living co-located together in like one module or one giant function or something like that, right? I think it's a much more digestible way for both myself as a person who's writing it to break that into separate steps of like, hey, connect to this API, read the response from it, handle errors from that response, like have X, Y, and Z steps to import that data. And I think if you're able to write those steps in plain English and follow them and break it into like more digestible chunks in terms of your authoring code when it's being reviewed by the rest of your team, that makes life a lot easier. And so when it comes to an interview itself, I think that same thing kind of applies. In the same way that I wouldn't want to just deliver all of my code at once in one giant PR and one giant module in that PR, like I think that the way that I think about it is that the interviewer is along for the ride with me. That there's maybe even some back and forth that we have in the same way that when I'm working on a feature with a teammate, I'd want to have back and forth with them and get their input and get clarification on things. Where it's like going back to this example that we have, if it's like in an interview and you're given the prompt of connecting to an API, like it's probably good to walk through the high level step of like, oh, I want to connect to this, maybe have some pseudocode, maybe take that time to bounce some assumptions about like the response of the API or like, if it's likely to be like kind of flaky, like do we really have to worry about errors or like rate limiting or anything like that? And like taking that time to not only break things up piecemeal, but again, work with the person that is interviewing you, because I think it's really important to kind of just like express your thought process as you're working through everything.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As somebody who has, during the job search, done my own technical interviews, and even as somebody who has delivered technical interviews, it probably changes interviewer to interviewer, but maybe 50% of what you're evaluated on is the solution that you're actually building. I think the other 50% is, as you mentioned, how well you communicate. And when I say communicate, I mean how well are you talking about, or how well are you at confirming your understanding of the use case that you're solving for?
Right.
How good are you at thinking through the different edge cases that are in front of you? How good are you at kind of sequencing the work and breaking it down? And how good are you at asking clarifying questions throughout? How good are you at taking feedback if the interviewer comes in and asks a question? Those are all important aspects of being a software engineer. You're going to get feedback. There are going to be edge cases. Most problems I get, maybe this is a reflection on me, or at least the teams that I've been on, but most tickets that I get, most stories I work on are really not well fleshed out. Very rarely have I had, a business analyst or a product owner that has been very, what I would say, has the developer mindset to be as detail oriented in describing what needs to be done as I would want. Usually it's some high level vision that they have. You're being evaluated on how well you can work on a team and kind of get, co-create the right solution there.
Yeah, exactly. I think you make a lot of really good points there. And like for each of those things that you're talking about, like each of those different skill sets of like working through edge cases, like collaborating with your PM to kind of like clarify the details of an implementation. Like if you're just like delivering everything all at once at the very end without showing your thought process along the way, that makes it really hard to dive into any of those other aspects of it, because it's kind of just like, it's almost like if you're doing a math test where they're like, show your work along the way. And if you don't do that, but you arrive at the right answer, it's like, okay, great. Did you actually know what you did or not? Or did you just like kind of luck into having the right answer there? But if you at least show your work, you can see like where somebody might have like taken a misstep if they have the problem wrong or not.
Typically the people that do the worst I've seen are just the people that jump right into solutioning. Right. But asking those questions, and then even just writing comments of like, step one, I'm going to do this. Step two, I'm going to do this. And, little comments inside the little code block that in the little web IDE that you're usually doing the test in. And then you using that way to kind of show your work, and then you kind of implement each block one at a time.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And depending on who's interviewing you, that might be sufficient for what you need, just to like stub out a function first, or like maybe they want you to implement like one of the 5 functions that you've stubbed out, rather than trying to do like just top to bottom and not seeing that higher like overarching picture. If you're like just so hyper focused on step one of like 5 or 6 steps, like it's hard for the interviewer to gauge like, did they actually have a plan for the rest of this problem that they were working on too.
Yeah, it's not top to bottom. Sometimes you need to write maybe some helper functions or whatever, and then that informs how you write that main code block that you're trying to solve for.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good takeaway there. So I know we've been talking a lot about like the technical interview here, and I think we got some good breakdown there. For there are other interviews though that are part of your typical, you know, job search journey outside that technical interview that you know, job search journey outside that technical interview earlier. How can they also prepare for those to be successful?
I think that there's a handful of common questions that tend to be used between different interviews at different companies, and I think it's worth like googling just like lists of common interview questions, and there might be things like, tell me about a time that you had a disagreement with a teammate, for example. That's one I've heard in many different interviews that I've had throughout my career. And I think just going through this process again of like thinking through these different prompts and like how you would respond to them is really helpful. And to take it a step further, you can even have like different stories that you associate with each of these answers. And it might be something that you've worked on directly at a company in a job as a software engineer, or it might be something that's like totally unrelated to software at all, where it's maybe like a group project that you had at school or something like that. I think it's easy to get caught up in the minutia of trying to answer a question directly. And that's something that I know that I've done because I'm always kind of like a stickler for details in that way. But I think it's important to kind of like take a step back and think about what the interviewer is actually asking you. What's the reason behind this question? I remember there was one time that an interviewer was very kindly asking me about like this project that I had worked on, and it was like specifically about scraping some data from a website. And I was like, yeah, I did this all myself, and I was like super proud of myself, even though I was like very early on in my career and like reinventing the wheel for like tools and libraries that already existed. So like the code itself, if he had seen it, I'm sure he would have been mortified. But the underlying point that I'm trying to get to is that he followed up and he'd be like, okay, well, you scripted yourself, but like, was there an API or like, did you like talk to anybody else about like how you might approach this? And I was like, no, I just did it all myself. And even in this example, he was like kind of being pretty heavy handed with leading me towards like, okay, but like, that's not the thing that I care about. Like, oh, great, you scraped the data yourself, but like, the things that I actually want to know about are like, are you capable of using existing tools and like working with people? And
Yeah.
I think if I had just not taken that question so literally, and if I had had like a little bit more context in working on a team as an engineer, like I would have answered it a lot differently in hindsight.
That is a good call out, and I'm sure it's got to be difficult for those that are, you know, neurodivergent or people that are coming into these conversations. I mean, you're already nervous, so it's going to be
Right?
hard for you to kind of take that step back and breathe and kind of think about the holistic picture. So practice, I definitely agree, is going to be good there. You mentioned some stories. Star format is a common one that I've heard. We have like a situation, task, action, result. It's how you kind of summarize in like a few short sentences a specific story, because you don't want to be blabbing on 30 minutes after one
Right.
question.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I found, and I want to get your thoughts on this. It can be overwhelming to think of all the different types of stories you might be asked and getting one ready for every kind of permutation. What I typically tell my mentees is just think about maybe 10 different stories, and then typically if you have 10 good comprehensive stories about like different types of work that you've done, if you get asked a question that's maybe tangential to one, at least you don't have a specific story prepared, but maybe you kind of wrap that story around to cover the question that you're being asked.
Yeah, yeah. I like that a lot. I like personally, I like tying stories to different projects that I've worked on because I feel like there's very clear objectives there from like things that I've worked on at work, and also there's like this whole environment of different people on the team, the different players for that project as well, and like the context of the situation we were in as like a company. Maybe we were trying to develop this really huge feature over the course of a quarter, or maybe we were like really rushed for time because we were trying to hit a certain deadline for a demo or something like that. And so I think that, like you're saying, having some kind of story prepared is really useful, but having like just a general idea of it lets you kind of like be more flexible when it comes to questions like you were saying, because you can like play up certain aspects of that story if you want, and like knowing the nuances helps you kind of like build this overall picture, but not have it be like, oh, there was only this one thing about this story that I care about.
Yeah, there's a quote from, I think it's President Eisenhower, but I might be wrong, where he talks about how planning is everything, but plans are nothing. The
Mm,
implication being that just the planning process forces you to think through all your different edge cases and be
yeah.
prepared. You have this body of work, but then when it comes to execution, the enemy's going to throw something at you, and you kind of don't know how to react. And if you just stick to the plan that you made, you're actually going to get yourself in trouble. But the planning
Sure.
process, you understand all the different various routes that you could take around a situation. So it's kind of the same for the job interview
Yeah.
if you think of it
Yeah.
that way.
I love that. I feel like it's very applicable to the interview process as well.
Yeah, and something you're talking about here, I think there's some nuance to call out. You talked about how proud you were of your implementation of that scraper. I think there's a balance there too, right? Where I get frustrated when I'm interviewing a developer and they keep using the words like, we did XYZ, we did
Mm,
ABC. It's like, I don't necessarily care like what your team did. Like, I want to know what was your contribution to that
mm.
solution. So, yeah, how do you balance kind of not being proud of your work without coming across as like really prideful or overbearing? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't really thought about that specific, like, I haven't thought about this through that specific lens of like how you can exactly balance like the personal accomplishment aspect versus like the team side of things. I I know that I have the tendency to err on the side of being more humble when I'm like talking about things that I've worked on. So I very much align with what you're describing of saying like we as a team did this thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about the other side of that, like what you're mentioning, where it's like you can kind of bluntly say like, "Oh, I did X, Y, and Z." One way to kind of make that softer is to acknowledge like where it wasn't like purely your effort as well, or like how you leveraged having teammates to get to that solution. Like I don't think it's wrong to say like, oh, I led this initiative to rewrite our reporting infrastructure or something like that, and like go into as many details as you want for that. But one way to kind of soften just the ego side of it of like I've done everything is to also acknowledge that it's the team that gets you there, right? Where it's like, oh, I initially proposed X, Y, and Z, and then after I had it open for code review, we actually realized that there were some downsides to this approach, and so I was like thankful that my teammates brought that up, and we like pivoted a little bit in the way that we architected it, and just kind of making sure that you're aware of how a team can help you just grow and enable you to write better software overall.
Sure, absolutely. That's a great perspective. Now, up to this point, I've been asking a lot of questions about the interview process in general, but I want to give you an opportunity in your book. Is there anything else that we haven't covered about the interview mistakes that developers make that we should cover?
I think one of the most influential chapters that has to do one of the most influential chapters from a lesson that I learned personally earlier on in my career was that there's like this fear of failure for things that I would kind of impose upon myself. And the way that that manifested was in some of the ways that we've talked about, right? Where I would be afraid of like failing in code review because I didn't want to have like my goal was just to have like no feedback in code review, which if you think about it is like insane, right? The entire purpose of code review is to have feedback, but I felt like I was failing by having too much feedback in it. And instead, over time, I've kind of like reframed my mentality towards it. And instead of saying like this is my code to protect from the team, I instead say we're in this as a team to try to come up with the best solution possible. So like again, my teammates are there for support, and I want to make sure that I'm using their alternative perspectives on things to try to create the best solutions possible. And while that certainly applies to code, I think it also applies to interviews, right? Like by trying to just get comfortable with going through more interviews. And it's hard because nobody likes being rejected for a job, right? Like it's a very clear cut paradigm of like either you get the job offer or you don't. And you can't help, like, I think it's natural to feel like, oh, I've failed in this interview, right? But I don't look at it that way so much anymore as the mentality that I have now is really you're trying to see from both sides if the company is a good fit for you and if you're a good fit for this particular role that is open. Just because they're not offering you a job today doesn't mean that there might not be another role in the future tomorrow where you would be the right fit and the right candidate for that. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. And again, going back to this idea of failure, like I don't think not getting a job is a failure. I think like not learning anything from the experience and not being introspective about ways that you could have prepared differently or different techniques you could utilize to like just think about how things went. Like I think that's where the opportunity lies is by being introspective about different interviews you've gone through, you're better prepared for other ones in the future.
Yeah, to say a little bit differently, getting rejected is not failure; it's just feedback. And
Yeah,
now people complain that you don't always get feedback from the recruiter. Sometimes they'll just
sure.
ghost you completely. Uh, but yeah, you'll have to rely on your own ability, kind of self-reflect on the experience to be able to walk away with that with some lesson learned. Because the worst thing you can do is just keep sending the same resume to the same job boards and getting the same rejections and
Right.
not change anything, or keep going interview after interview, getting rejected and not changing how you prepare.
Yeah.
It's the definition of insanity, right? You got to doing the same thing over and
Right.
over again.
Yeah. And I think it's important to lean on your like personal network for things too. Like I've had like even you're right. Like a lot of the time, companies don't want to be liable from like a legal or HR perspective of giving you feedback and like maybe disqualifying you for a reason that's like not valid legally or whatever, or they just don't even want to open themselves up to that liability. And so I've had like a lot of companies where yeah they just turn me down and don't offer any information and I get it now from their perspective, but there's like I would encourage anybody who's watching this, who's interviewing, to not just give up at that point or not just throw in the towel because there are other things you can do. Like I've had code submissions where I thought they were pretty strong, and then I got rejected after at that phase of the interview, and I like shared my solution with a friend of mine, and he was like, "Yeah, actually, there's like these four things that you could have done differently," and although it hurts to hear, I was really appreciative to him. And I think even the same thing of if there's like any questions that you maybe have a sense of not going as well during an interview, like you can bounce those off people in your network too, or like you can go and just take somebody out to coffee who has gone through this process recently, like they did just land a job in software engineering, and just get that perspective from them and try to learn as much as you can about it.
Yeah, for those who are starting out and may not have a network, if you're going through a boot camp, you probably have some alumni network that you can reach out to who they should be willing to kind of help you out. Or local meetup groups in your area based off of the language or tech stack that you're working on, or really just reaching out to people on LinkedIn. I mean, it's hard. We're starting out when you don't know anybody, but there
Right.
are avenues there to get the feedback that you want. Some services I'll make sure to include in the show notes that are for free include something like called ADP List or Mentor Color. These are all just sites where you can sign up for mentoring, and there are experienced software developers who can hop on a call with you for 30 minutes and walk you through
That's
something
great.
pretty easily. So I'll
Yeah.
include those if anybody's looking for some feedback if you're not getting it from the recruiting team at least.
Yeah. And I think in general, like anybody that you know in the software industry, like from my own personal experience, people tend to be very generous with their time, and a lot of people can relate to being earlier on in your career. And the harsh truth of it is that landing that first job is like by far the hardest aspect of breaking into software. And so like you can get over that, then things become a lot easier afterwards. But the journey for everybody is going to be different to getting there, and I think it's important to again try to be as strategic as you can and not get discouraged, even though it is tough just to get a rejection.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alex, before we wrap up though, I want to give you a chance to kind of describe this book here. We've hinted a little bit at it. We've talked about some of these interview mistakes specifically. I'm sure there's a lot more covered in that book. Can you give us kind of a high level summary of the topics that are covered there and where people can find it?
Sure. Yeah, the book is called Keep Calm and Code On. It's basically me going through a lot of the mistakes that I've made throughout my career and what I would do differently to avoid those same mistakes. In particular, it covers a lot of soft skills and mental models for how I approach software. So, like what I was talking about before, of going from this mentality of submitting code for code review is like this thing that is pristine that I'm trying to protect from everybody else, and making that shift from thinking that way to instead thinking about how can we as a team build software, and how can I get feedback to make this code that I'm writing even better. That's like the exact kind of mental model that I think has enabled me to go a lot further in software throughout my career. And there's a lot of books that talk about code and writing code, and this one is more about like once you know how to code, what's like everything else that you need to kind of keep growing as an engineer.
Well, that's really great for you to highlight your own weaknesses and mistakes in your journey. That's got to be a little uncomfortable, but really appreciate you putting yourself out there to share that with the community.
Yeah.
Is there any way, okay, is there, or how would people, if they're interested in finding out your book, how can they find it?
Sure. The website is keepcalmandcodon.com. And if you go there, there's also a link to contact me. It has my email on the contact page as well, or like you can add me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat with anybody who's like getting started in their software journey. And if there's ways I can help, please let me know.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alex. I'll put that link in our show notes. That's all the time that we have for today. So I just want to say thank you again, Alex, for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for tuning in to the Junior Jobs Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please remember to like and subscribe, as that helps us reach more developers in need. And don't forget to check the show notes for details on today's sponsor and other job search services that we provide.